How do you design a great final boss for your game? That question has haunted us for the last couple of months, but now we finally might have an answer. So, what steps did we take to create our final boss? Well, in order to make a great final boss, you first of all need a great main villain. In the tutorial for Billy's Nightmare, you are introduced to the Boogeyman, who is the main villain of this game. He reveals his evil plans to you, and then proceeds to steal Mr. Sandman's dreamcatcher. You know, that very important thing you have to save, in order to stop all the repeating nightmares and complete the game. Anyway, after a short fight, the Boogeyman manages to escape with the dreamcatcher before you have a chance to kill him. So we knew that we needed a new level with a final boss fight, where you get to defeat the Boogeyman and save Mr. Sandman's dreamcatcher. We also knew that we wanted the Boogeyman to be a lot bigger in this fight, compared to when you meet him in the tutorial. And since he now has Mr. Sandman's powerful dreamcatcher, we could use that as an explanation to why the Boogeyman is a lot more dangerous the second time you fight him. But what would the theme for this new level be, and what would the new bigger Boogeyman look like? In many similar games, the large boss is placed at the top of the room, often shown from the waist up. But since we wanted the Boogeyman to be drawn in 8 directions, it wouldn't make sense to put him at the top of the room and only show animations where he looks down at you. Our second idea was to place a big hole in the middle of the boss room and have the upper body of the Boogeyman rotate in 8 directions from there. But this way, the boss and his big upper body would always obscure the player if you fight him from above. So we instead decided to make the Boogeyman a bit smaller, so we could have him fully visible and walk around in the room, while still making him bigger than in the tutorial. But the most important question remained: what would he look like? We knew that we wanted him to be scary, and what is the scariest thing there is? Well, spiders, of course. So we decided to keep his upper body pretty similar to his old design, but replace his lower body with some mechanical spider legs. Fabian started drawing a walk animation for the spider legs, but I suggested that we should build his legs with loose parts instead. This way, we could adjust the height and rotation of his upper body in-game, and the legs would update their angles automatically. The only problem was that I had no idea how to achieve this. So I created a placeholder version of the boss and placed it in Billy's bedroom. This way, I could start the game and quickly see the result of changes in my code, without having to travel to a certain level in the game every time. I attached a leg to the moving torso and tried to get the angles to look correct. It felt good that we finally had begun working on our final boss, even if this first version of him looked pretty awful. While I struggled with the dynamic animations for the spider legs, it was also time for us to decide what the theme for the boss level would be. When you fight the Boogeyman in the tutorial, his evil presence has turned Mr. Sandman's temple into a nightmare, full of lava and tentacles. So it felt obvious that the last level would have a similar theme. Our first idea was that you would land with your bed in a start room, like all the other levels. You would then go up through a corridor and enter the Tooth Fairy shop one last time, and then go up through a second corridor where you would finally enter the boss room. The problem was that we couldn't figure out what the start room would look like, and if the shop would have a unique look for this level. So we finally got the idea to combine the start room and the shop to the same room. We decided that the majority of this last level would consist of lava, with small islands instead of rooms, and bridges instead of corridors. To get an idea of what everything would look like, we made some beautiful concept art of the start room, which would be an island where the friendly NPCs had set up a small camp. Billy would land with his bed in the middle of the room as usual. Instead of working at his anvil, Santa's elf would chop some nightmare tentacles and use them to build a small campfire. The Tooth Fairy wouldn't bring her table or cash register, she would instead sell her items from a carpet on the ground. At the top of the island, Mr. Sandman would wait for Billy and give him some last words of encouragement before moving up to fight the Boogeyman. We now had an idea of what the start room of the boss level would look like, but we still had to figure out what to do with the boss room itself. While we tried to figure out the layout for the rest of the boss level, Fabian had now finished some more sprites for the Boogeyman. This way, I didn't have to use my ugly placeholder graphics for the torso anymore, while working on the spider legs. But I still had some problems with getting the legs to work. You see, I used to animate the angles of the legs manually, rotating the upper leg a certain amount of degrees, moving the torso, and finally rotating the lower leg. This took forever, and I also noticed that the result wasn't exact enough, because the foot kept sliding around on the floor. So this method of animating the legs wouldn't work. I then realized that the angles of the leg actually formed a triangle, so instead of animating the angles manually, I could just use some good old trigonometry to do it for me. The only problem was that I didn't remember how trigonometry worked. So I asked for advice on the Game Maker forum and got some help from an awesome guy called Nacho Chicken. He provided me with the code I needed to calculate my angles for the spider legs. But even though I had this new code for the angles, I still had some problems to figure out how to use it to get the legs to move in the direction I wanted. After tweaking some numbers, I could finally get the angles to work. So I added the rest of the legs, and it was very satisfying to move the torso around and see how the legs updated their angles automatically. The next step was to make the legs move up and down, and also adjust their position on the ground when the Boogeyman moves around. Getting the legs to move up and down was pretty easy, but getting the foot to land on the correct spot was a bit more difficult. Basically, I had to make a code that checks where the Boogeyman will be a certain amount of frames in the future. This way, the feet knew where to land before he even reaches that position. Meanwhile, Fabian had now finished drawing the torso in 8 directions and had finally given the Boogeyman a couple of arms. In one of his hands, the Boogeyman is holding his classic staff that we saw him use in the game's tutorial. And in the other hand, he is holding Mr Sandman's stolen dreamcatcher. The Boogeyman was now basically finished, and it looked really cool to see him walk around with his automatically animated spider legs. So it was finally time to finish his boss room, so we didn't have to test him in Billy's bedroom anymore. While I made the last adjustments to the Boogeyman's animations, Fabian had now finished the tileset for the new level. So we built a version of the island where you will land with your bed to get a feel for what the new level would look like. While it was a cool concept to be surrounded by a sea of lava, we realized that the textures looked a bit repetitive. So we decided that we should probably add some smaller islands here and there to break the repeating pattern. But besides looking repetitive, the lava would also give us some performance issues. Because every tile is an object with animations, which also spawns a lot of fire particles. And in the finished level, we'd probably have tens of thousands of lava objects, and that just wouldn't be sustainable. So I added a few lines of code that deactivates lava objects outside the camera view. Even though the game looks the same, we're now only rendering around 100 lava objects, instead of tens of thousands. Now that we had solved our performance issues, we could finally continue building the level and the boss room itself. Our idea is that you will walk up from the island and find this huge gate, which leads to the Boogeyman's room. The room will have the theme of a ruined church or temple surrounded by lava. And since this will be the final boss fight, we also decided to add some lava to the room itself to make it a bit more challenging, something that we haven't done for any of our other boss fights. In the middle of the room, there will be an altar where the Boogeyman keeps Mr Sandman's stolen dreamcatcher. And when you walk up to the altar and interact with the dreamcatcher, the Boogeyman will appear and the fight will begin. But even though we like the theme for the room, we're not really pleased with how it turned out. The lava, obviously, takes a lot of focus, and the walls and floor have almost identical colors. So we're afraid that the player will have to focus more on navigating the room than how to fight the boss. Which of course is something that you don't want, especially for your final boss fight. But the layout and the colors of the room can always be replaced. Now we at least have a foundation for the boss room, and we don't have to use Billy's bedroom to test the Boogeyman anymore. It has taken us almost 2 months to build everything for this last boss fight. All the way from coming up with the design for the Boogeyman, to getting the animations for his spider legs to work, and to finally combining them with his 8 directional sprites. And of course, making our beautiful concept art, and later turning it into a full level. Now with everything in place, the only thing that remains to fix for the boss fight is the fight itself. We have actually been so busy with building the boss and his level that we haven't figured out what kind of attacks that the Boogeyman should have. So we'd love to hear some ideas from you guys. So, what kind of attacks should the final boss have? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.